Hello and welcome to an introductory presentation on how to interpret OCT images of the skin. Here we're going to take a look at some nodular BCC, some superficial and infiltrated BCC, AK and also squamous cell carcinoma. Finally, at the end, we'll also have a look at some other conditions that can be seen. It's not a comprehensive guide to image interpretation, but it should prove a really good way to get you going. The way it's going to work is that for any particular condition, the first slide will have some text detailing the characteristics of what to look for with OCT. The second slide will then put that into context by showing these features on an actual real-life OCT image, along with the histology and what can be seen with the naked eye. The third and final slide will then show a looping, real-time, fly-through video of the OCT scan, which mimics a clinician scrolling through the scan. It's important to note that the resolution of the images you're about to see has been significantly affected by the compression that YouTube applies to the video in order to host it on the web. In other words, new customers of VivoSight will receive a much higher resolution version of the presentation that's easier to interpret. That said, this video is certainly sufficient to get a good feeling for the different characteristics which you'll need to look out for with OCT. Finally, the slides will advance every 10 seconds, so it's recommended that if you've not finished looking at a particular slide, then you simply pause the video when you hear the words "Next slide." To quickly jump between different parts of the video, please navigate using the chapter markers in the video description below. Right, let's get going. The presentation begins now. Next slide. 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 Next slide.